Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking some time out to learn about this major feature of SEER software, which has been out a few years now and already is in common use at a number of organizations with quite a few users attached to each. So this is a relatively mature technology that we've been adding on ever since we first released it, and I'm going to show you all the features that are now present in this. We started with the title that you saw before, but I thought that this is the same title by accident. I'm sorry, but I thought the alternative title would have been something like the SEER database, more than just a database. With that in mind, let's proceed. So the SEER Enterprise Database is a shared database which can hold estimates by SEER-SIM, SEER-IT, and SEER for hardware. The estimates are held in the database to be saved, retrieved. You can start a project as a file and then save it to the database. You can also start a project in the database, save it to a file. The database itself can sit down the hallway, on a desktop. You can even carry it on a laptop if you wanted to, but really it's intended as an enterprise database, and that's why we named it Enterprise Database. It can and does often sit in far-flung locations so that people in multiple sites can share estimates using the database, which we deliver in SQL Server and can potentially deliver in other versions, but it's primarily a SQL Server database. Within SEER, it is easily accessible by the user. There's a menu we call Collaboration because that's what the Enterprise Database is all about, collaboration. You connect to the Enterprise Database from that menu. From the top, you can see under the Collaboration menu, there's the default Enterprise Database. You connect that, and then using the Microsoft Standard dialogues below, you specify an ODBC source name and use your credentials to connect. As the dialog shows, I think you can see my pointer, it's an ODBC source name. If you're familiar with ODBC, and many of you are already, that's a standardized way of connecting to databases that Microsoft provides, and we're just piggybacking on that standard way. It's very convenient because you can refer to a potentially complicated external database with just a name. And then the connection itself can be handled in one of two ways. You can use the built-in directory services, so your credentials on a Microsoft network establish what's called a trusted connection. Alternatively, you can specify a login ID and password, and you're connected to the database. Now, once you are connected to the database, you go to the File menu, and again, quite simply, we keep on using the term easy because, well, it is. You go to the File, Open from Database, and you will be presented, well, on the File menu, you're presented with multiple menu options, Open from Database being one. Here I show the Save to Database because you're going to start by creating a project and saving it to the database, and this is the screen that you see. You enter the project name, and then you have a bunch of entries which aren't actually in the file saving but are in the database saving. When you save to the SEER database, you can specify categories, you can provide comments about what you've just saved, you can add a change description, which comes to play when dealing with revisions, and you can also edit project attributes. I'll get into more detail about several of the things I just mentioned. I just wanted to show you first how you save to the database and all the varied and much richer information that you're permitted to enter when you do save to that database, to the enterprise. We call it formally the SEER Enterprise Database. The first time a user sits down at his or her desktop and wants to connect to the Enterprise Database, you go into the same dialog I showed you on the previous screen, Default Database, but you click that little button next to it, and you'll be able to connect through the data source, ODBC data sources, to a externally specified database. The first time you connect, there may be no database that's defined for use on your machine, and so you go about creating it. You go into Select Data Source, which is not a SEER dialog. It's actually, or a SEER hardware or IT dialog for that matter. It's a Microsoft dialog. And you select New, and then you connect to the database using a built-in wizard. Typically, the whole process, again, we have many users using this, many desktops already deployed using the database, the SEER database. Typically, this whole process takes mere minutes. If the database connects faster, it takes fewer minutes. That's the biggest source of delay, in fact, just connecting to the database, not navigating one's way through these. It's very simple to use. So I went through the idea of connecting to a central database just now, saving your projects to it, and opening projects, maybe saving some more information. But at this point, there's really no more to the database than you probably came in expecting. Of course, a database is shared, and so more efficient. You don't have to point people to file locations or transfer them in some other way, get them lost in a big directory. They're all on a database to search. Of course, it's more secure. You can manage that and provide restrictions to access to the database, as we saw, using trusted or passwords. And of course, it's better insured against loss. It's a database. You have a database architect and manager ensuring that backups are made and other precautions are taken with an enterprise-level database. So nothing is different there, but there are distinct advantages to using a database, which is why we initially provided one for everyone to use. As time went on, we realized that there were many additional features we could build into SEER that would leverage the use of the database. And I'm going to show you all of those now. The first thing that we noticed was that you can enter much more information into the Save Database, Save Project dialog, the category entry, the comments, the change description. And then there was a button called Edit Project Attributes. Project attributes are custom defined by the user. Typically, when the site installs SEER software, the users of that software, the enterprise, decides on what sort of project attributes they want to create. They can be a select list. Here we see 3 items that are drop downs, which have previously assigned items in them. They're all textual. We can also enter date information. We can enter numeric information, and we can enter free text right here. We can also specify ranges so that there are permissible ranges for entry. The idea in general, though, is that all these entries are created by you, by whomever uses the SEER database. They may have specific goals in mind. For example, we want to record who this project is assigned to, and so we have an assigned dialog, what the workflow state is, in process, completed, etc. We may want to record what the priority of the project is, so we created a priority low, medium, high, rush. And we have other goals in mind, such as email recipients, things like that. And other parameters here were just placed here so you could see the wealth of varied and sometimes indecipherable information you might specify, but which makes sense to any given enterprise, maybe something that we didn't build in, but which is unique and special and critical potentially to your own practices. And so all that can be entered under project attributes. The next thing that we built in was a rich directory, so that when you do open from a database, open a project from the database, this is what you see. You see not just the project name, which is what you'll see when you open a file directory to open a SEER project file. When you open SEER projects from the database, you'll see multiple columns here showing the comments that you entered when you saved the project, the category that you entered in that same dialog, but also information on the owner. So here we have two different owners working with projects, and we record who owns that project, who saved it first. And then revisions. As you save a project into the database, you have the revisions recorded, and they go upwards as more saves are made. The next column shows who revised that project, the date and time of last revision, change descriptions. A much richer view than the file view would provide. Revisions, I'm just going to zero in on revisions for a second, can be saved in lesser revisions or higher revisions. Lesser revisions are saved automatically, but you can also check that box, save as highest revision, and select the next major baseline. If you select the next major baseline, you're going to increment that revision to 2.0. And you can provide change descriptions at every revision. Here's an example of how useful, how powerful revisions can be. This project here, Watcher, is in revision 7. So I think to myself, wow, 7 revisions. What happened in the previous revisions? Well, I can actually click that little box there and see what happened, what the major revisions were, and the change description at each one. Our customers deal with estimates that are oftentimes, or usually, quite critical, and they do need to understand how the estimate changed over time. With the revision feature, you have a built-in audit trail and a built-in way of seeing how an estimate took shape over time. And you can then open any revision you choose to gain further insight into what the project state was, what the estimate state was at any given point. A database is about permissions as much as it's about anything else. And the basic permissions on a database I showed you earlier in the form of access to the database, either using Windows authentication, trusted authentication, or a SQL Server login. But we go much further than that. The first dialog here, these are all examples of the sorts of permissions that might be triggered or lack of permissions, lack thereof. The first dialog, it shows that a project was locked for revision, which is a natural sort of permission to have on a database. You don't want two people editing the project at the same time. The next dialog shows a little bit of enhancement where permissions are granted for certain actions only. By using the database, you can give some people permission to just view the project but not change it. And that is a use case we often see in the real world, where we want to share the project, but we don't want to share too much of the project and have people maybe changing it in unforeseen ways. And then the last permission is a modification permission, a variation on view. We have modify, and we have various others that I'll show you. But these are all examples of when you open a project or save a project, how the permissions on that project can trigger various restrictions. We have a standalone tool called the SEER Enterprise Database Manager, which accomplishes a number of things, but one of its chief uses is to establish permissions on projects. There are tabs across the top that you can see here: summary, SEER users, general permissions, and so on. Each of these tabs accomplishes a different level of permission or level of fidelity or perspective on permissions. In the General User Permissions tab, I can say that certain people are permitted to do certain things and others are permitted to do different things. If I go to the other tabs, you can see how permissions can be specified in more detail potentially. On the Project-Specific Permissions tab, I can say that this user is allowed to view a project but not permitted to modify the project. And you saw that trigger on the previous screen where the user wasn't permitted to save a project. They didn't have modify ability. On the Project Owner tab, I can actually specify who owns what. I can say that an estimate project is owned by multiple people. I can change an owner. I can see who the owners currently are. And then on the project list dialog, I can get a feeling for what projects there currently are. It basically gives me a bird's eye view of what I'm dealing with in the database in its entirety. And shown here is SEER for IT. If I were to select that dialog, I would see SEER for software, SEER for hardware, SEER for IT. So 3 of the projects, the products currently support the Enterprise Database. The most recent feature we built into the DB, or Enterprise Database, is email notification. Email notification is a way, well, it's exactly the way it sounds. When you do something inside a project, that could be saving it, that could be creating a new one, it could be changing a custom attribute, for example. That previous list, if I specified priority to high, it could trigger an action. If I change the status, it could also trigger an action. Trigger an action in this case meaning sending an email. And then I can decide who the email is sent to in one of 2 ways, using free text. Here I entered my email address, or selecting from pre-specified lists of people. In this case, I selected Dave. We would both get an email saying, well, whatever the rule triggered was. It could be I created a new project. So both of us will get an email saying that the project was triggered. In this case, the project was triggered. In this case, I'm changing fields in a project, and the email notification system was set up to record and send out a notification whenever fields were updated. So whenever anything got updated in a project, it's going to send out that email. The email triggers that I mentioned in the last slide are very flexible and can be quite powerful. They're actually, we deliver a bunch of them, and you can just say true, false, and be done with it, because the triggers we deliver with this feature are sufficiently broad. However, we actually have a little language which permits you to create all sorts of combinations of Booleans to suit very specific needs for triggering emails. You can change custom fields, SEER parameters, email recipients can even trigger a change, an email notification, and new projects or revisions, and any combination of these. We have so many features on top of the SEER database now that we enable brand new uses for it. For example, custom fields such as status and priority plus email notification can result in a lightweight workflow system where, as you make changes, you update people and maybe pass along the baton to other editors. Any sort of, well, not any sort of, but a wide number of workflow scenarios can now be handled by customized fields coupled with customized logic in the email notification feature. And so we started this presentation by talking about the SEER database and how easy the Enterprise Database is to set up, to use, to to refer to on the desktop if you need to connect to a new database. But those were all basic database features that we just do and do well because it's a very refined product at this point. But the features enabled by the SEER Enterprise Database are the other story. Custom-defined project attributes, a very rich project directory way beyond what file system can provide you, product revisions that let you see the history of revisions, the change descriptions, look at revisions, pull revisions over time to see what happened when, access controls and permissions management that give you potentially broader, very fine-grained control over who owns, who's permitted to modify and view a project, email notification of changes that is not just a simple notification but can be as flexible as you need it to be, and then enabling this by previous features, a lightweight estimate workflow system, finally. And, of course, this is a product in motion, so those of you who've had the database for years may be surprised to see some of these new features, and we're indeed planning other ones for the future. But at this point, all these are working and delivered.